So one of the things that I'm convinced about is the idea of Theosophy, which is God wisdom, if you translate it from the original Greek, is that we all have an inner life that connects us in some way with spiritual worlds and with the divine. And one of the people in the Theosophical Society who was particularly interested in exploring these inner worlds was Charles Webster Leadbeater, C.W. Leadbeater. And I think of these worlds as being somewhat foreign or even alien to most people, which is one of the reasons why I call this tour a safari. There are some very interesting places that Leadbeater went and wrote about, and some very interesting ways that he tended to view the world. And I've been researching his works for over a decade now, with the intention of writing a book that can help people understand what he was trying to do, where he was going, the principles he was operating from, and even what we can use now, what's relevant today from these teachings. A lot of what Leadbeater pioneered you'll find in later New Age books by various authors, and they tend to forget that he may have been the originator of such things, and I'll point this out in some of the later slides in my talk. So here's a portrait of Leadbeater in old age. And just to give you a very brief outline of his life, which I'm not going to deal with in any depth. Born in England, he was an Anglican clergyman that he became in his 20s. Joined the TS not long after he was ordained in 1883. And then, as a result of this, ended up traveling very widely throughout the Theosophical Society. And he worked in many countries: Ceylon, India, Burma, England, America, Europe, Java, and Australia. And he is particularly a specialist in what we call in the Theosophical Society the third object, the first one being universal brotherhood, or I like to call it unity consciousness. The second one being the comparative study of science, religion, and philosophy. And the third object is the investigation of hidden laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. And over the years, this has tended to be a neglected object of the Theosophical Society. From the very beginning, Madame Blavatsky said that universal brotherhood is the one that we need to be responsible for, all of us. The others are, in a sense, optional, but of course not to be neglected. What Leadbeater says about the third object is occultism is simply the study of the inner side of nature and of man, or human beings, and that study is necessary so that you may see the whole of life and not merely a part. So the idea is that we have an outer life, we also have an inner life. And in my opinion, and in the work that I do when I'm traveling for the Theosophical Society, I'm trying to encourage people to share their inner life, because it seems to be one of the ways that we build community. And I find that when people do that, they want to know more and they want to come back. They want to meet other people and have an opportunity to learn about their inner life and tell something about their own. So Leadbeater often worked in tandem with Annie Besant, who's another one of my special areas of research. This is a picture from the early 1900s that shows the two of them together. Leadbeater probably would have been close to 50 years old at that time. So I have a few texts that I'd like to offer you that I think are especially apropos of our subject, and then I'll talk about the books interspersed between the texts. If what you are dealing with is what you can see on the physical plane only, that is a very superficial view. There is always an inner side to everything in connection with the higher planes, and nearly always that inner side is a good deal more important than the outer side. And so, if we are to have any sort of a reasonable theory of life, we must study that inner side of things. I think that is the reason for the promulgation of the third object. So now you understand perhaps a little better why I'm titling this talk Inner Life Safari. It's also important to understand that Leadbeater was a very clear and reasonable prose writer, and this makes him very attractive for especially people who are new to theosophical teachings. Some would say that it's also a little bit misleading because the technical side is equally important. But I find when I'm talking about Leadbeater, it's a little easier to encourage people to read his books than it is to read Besant's books, which have a more of a 19th century flavor than his writing does. So the first subject that we're going to talk about is astral travel, and Leadbeater's books on this subject, mostly published fairly early in his career in the Theosophical Society. The astral plane, the devachanic plane, which talks about the next higher plane above the astral, sometimes called the mental plane, and invisible helpers, which I think is especially interesting, which promotes the idea that if you want to have out-of-body experiences and astral travel experiences, you need to be open to the idea of being of service somehow on the other side. In other words, helping lost souls, helping people who have passed on, who don't necessarily know that that's the case because of some traumatic accident, and this kind of thing. The book itself, Invisible Helpers, is not an easy read, not because it's complicated, but because he greatly simplified at least the beginning of it in order to encourage children to get interested in the idea of becoming invisible helpers. And it often happens that if you've had any kind of astral projection experience, it occurred when you were very young. You might have had the experience of feeling like you were floating up around the ceiling as you were falling asleep at night. And then his book on dreams, What They Are and How They Are Caused. Now, as I'm going through this, I want to point out books that I find are particularly interesting or useful to read. The Dreams book is not one of them. Interestingly enough, Freud's book, Interpretation of Dreams, is a much more thorough covering of the territory, and I think it isn't read as much as it should be now because everybody thinks everything about Freud is about sex. And what he actually did was he taxonomized dreams into many different categories and types and many dreaming phenomena. And it's so thorough and complete that if you really want to know something about dreams, I would definitely recommend that over Leadbeater's book. So again, a quotation from a book called The Inner Life, which I'll talk about in a later slide, especially about the idea of clairvoyant power. This is something that's a controversial subject in the Theosophical Society, especially because the idea of the word power makes it sound like power over something instead of an ability. The possession of clairvoyant power is a very great privilege and a very great advantage, and if properly and sensibly used, it may be a blessing and a help to its fortunate holder, just as surely as, if it is misused, it may often be a hindrance and a curse. The principal dangers attendant upon it arise from pride, ignorance, and impurity, and if these be avoided, as they easily may be, nothing but good can come from it. So, probably the best way to explain what he means by pride, ignorance, and impurity is to refer to a Woody Allen movie that came out back in the 1980s. It'll take me a minute to remember the exact title of it, but the premise was Woody Allen was a writer. He was having trouble getting inspiration. He had a muse who would come to him, and at some point, he ended up taking some Chinese herbs that made him invisible. And the first thing that he did when he was invisible was he visited the women's changing rooms in department stores. And of course, he became visible while he was in there, so he got into trouble. That would be an example of what is meant by especially ignorance and impurity here.
Was that Alice?
Alice, exactly. Thank you. So Christianity was another focus for him, as you might understand, because of his background as an Anglican clergyman. And he actually attempted to completely reform Christianity along what he would call esoteric lines, starting with a book on the Christian Creed, where he was interpreting, supposedly clairvoyantly, what the authors of the Creed actually meant. And it's debatable, of course, in the history of religions as to how much that clairvoyance is actually useful. But if you think about it as a revisioning of what Christianity could be, if it wasn't so narrow and sectarian in some of its branches, you can see that actually we need to think more about it as a vision of the future or possible future than as an interpretation of the past. he also used his clairvoyant investigations to look into the sacraments, such as the Eucharist, and see what was going on. Were there angels involved? And if so, what were they doing? And what kind of angels were they? And it's quite an interesting book to read from the standpoint of all the different colors of rays and the glowings and the moments when this or that happens in the angel kingdom. I can't say that I've experienced a lot of that in a normal church, but I went to a liberal Catholic church in Ojai several years ago, and there was definitely a lot of interesting, uplifting things happening there that I haven't experienced in other churches. And Leadbeater was primarily responsible for the crafting of that religion called the Liberal Catholic Church. In a sense, the science of the sacraments was the theoretical aspect of that church. And then we have a book called The Hidden Side of Christian Festivals, which from the title you would think was not going to be terribly interesting. However, there's about 40 pages in that book that is some of the most beautiful and interesting writing about the theosophical idea of angels that I've yet encountered. And so I recommend checking that book out if you have an opportunity. And then a more recent book edited and annotated by Richard Smoley is Christian Gnosis, which was made up of papers left after Leadbeater's death. Some of these books come in alternative titles, which I also want to point out. Oh yes, in the Science of the Sacraments, there's a section called The Soul and Its Vestures that came from a lecture of 1904. That also is very worth reading from the standpoint of the theosophical idea of subtle bodies and planes. So the Festival of the Angels is the section of the Hidden Side of Christian Festivals that I recommend. So the Hidden Side of Christian Festivals has also been republished in a shortened version called The Inner Side of Christian Festivals. You might be able to find that a little more easily. One of the things that Leadbeater is known for in some areas of the Theosophical Society is an apparent breaking away from the teachings and traditions of H.P. Blavatsky, one of our founders. In his own words, though, he did try to point out that there was always some connection or some justification for his procedures based on the way that she was teaching him. So I wanted to include some of those because they're worth considering. They seem to be forgotten by those who want to put Leadbeater down as ignorantly trying to recreate Theosophy in his own image, if you want to say it that way. So Madame Blavatsky always said to us, now here are the facts, but don't believe them because I tell you. You must take them, turn them over in your mind, see whether they appear reasonable to you, whether they are the best way of accounting for life, and whether they solve any of your problems. If you accept them, you must do so not on my authority, but because having examined them, you think them to be the best hypotheses that have yet been put before you. Now, I think here I want to highlight the idea whether they solve any of your problems. There's an awful lot of esoteric literature that wouldn't necessarily come under that heading of solving your own or anyone else's problems. And you have to watch out, I believe, for overly elaborated systems because you can get lost in the elaboration of the systems. Leadbeater was definitely interested in the problems of humanity, and so to that extent, we can investigate his teachings on the basis of how they may have solved some of our problems. So clairvoyance was another focus for his writings, and I have a couple of slides for this because it was a preoccupation throughout his many years of involvement with the Theosophical Society. And I also have some pictures from some of these books. He often had artists working with him to illustrate the clairvoyant visions, and some of this art is quite beautiful and also ended up being quite an inspiration for subsequent generations of artists. So the first collaboration between him and Besant was occult chemistry. 1895 was the initial publication of some observations that they made together during that year in one of the Theosophical journals. Then it was published in book form in 1908, a revised version in 1919, where their editor, A.P. Sinnott, tried to create some order out of chaos because it wasn't very well organized. And then much, much later, in 1951, later president of the Theosophical Society, Jinnarajah Dasa, added a bunch of notes that were not published in 1919 that had been elaborated as a result of investigations that he and Leadbeater did for the next, what would it have been, 15 years or so before Leadbeater died. Thought Forms is the most famous, perhaps, of that book, of the Clairvoyant's books, among academics especially, because it was an inspiration to the idea of abstract art, starting with Kandinsky and his book concerning the spiritual in art. The book on clairvoyance talks about some of his abilities. Personally, I don't find that quite as interesting as some of the later ones, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. Man, Visible and Invisible is one of the famous illustrated books. Just like Thought Forms has illustrations of thought forms, Man, Visible and Invisible has illustrations of auras, and some of these are so famous you've probably seen them. Here are a couple of occult chemistry diagrams. I like to give psychics and clairvoyants and spiritual teachers of all stripes the benefit of the doubt that they are teaching something and that they have perceived something and they're trying to communicate something. And the question often is, for us who may or may not have similar abilities, what is that something they were trying to communicate? There have been attempts to explain Leadbeater's strange diagrams of the atoms in terms of string theory and ultra small particles, quantum particles, and other dimensions and so on. Personally, in my own investigations of these things, I can't say anything useful about this. Although I heard a British theosophist who was a material scientist talk about these diagrams, and he said everything is constantly rotating in several directions at once, which makes sense in a way and seems advanced somehow and still doesn't solve any of my problems. There's a thought form from Thought Forms. I love this one because I think the idea of those pink sort of angel wings is a really good visualization for helping send somebody support. He has it as love, peace, protection, and benediction. I think of it as support. And I teach my own students to visualize something like this wrapping around someone's aura when they need some particular kind of healing help or emotional support or things of that, spiritual support, things of that nature. It seems that this color pink is associated with what in Theosophy we call the Buddhic level of being or unity consciousness. And I think that's one of the reasons why a thought form like this can be really useful. The idea behind a thought form is you create it visually and recognize that it has a reality on a subtle level of existence. And then you're able to project it out and send it to someone as a message. This is another picture from the Thought Forms book. This is what happens in a church when someone is playing sacred music on the organ, as visualized by Leadbeater. This particular piece is one by Mendelssohn. And there's a great one by Wagner, too, that looks like a melting wedding cake that I like quite a lot. These were also very inspiring to people, and I'm trained as a composer. I've never quite seen a thought form in color like that, but I know when I'm composing, I have inner visions of the music that I'm making that have a sort of spatial color connection to them. So this is very relevant. I've been trying to identify, if possible, the location of this church and when this experiment was done, and I think I've narrowed it down. Nobody famous, but I'm not quite confident enough to reveal the name, but one of these days it'll come out in a journal somewhere, I hope. So this is from Man, Visible and Invisible. I was lucky enough to find a copy of the first edition on eBay for a reasonable price. Any of you who know this illustration will recognize that it's got a lot more orange and red in it in the recent publications. And I thought I would present this one because it creates rather a different impression. I think it's a little less aggressive than the other one is because of the pinks and oranges. This is a portrait of the aura of a master. And supposedly the master, you can't see a human figure in the center, but In the more recent versions, it's a little clearer. And the idea is that this aura is enormous. It covers a mile or two surrounding the master. So again, Leadbeater on his own experience of clairvoyance. When I have tried to follow Madame Blavatsky's example in spreading the gospel of Theosophy, I always said, don't believe anything just because I tell you, because I am liable to make mistakes just as any human being can. I can only tell you what I have seen, what has been revealed. It is perfectly real to me, and I have taken a good deal of trouble to convince myself that it is not merely an illusion. So I like the humility behind this, and Leadbeater was often thought about in some sectors of the society as having had a kind of authoritarian or arrogant approach to his own ideas. And I think that might have been a mistake based on the fact that once he published something, he never really tried to explain himself. The idea was he tried to get it as clear as he could, and if you were able to read something into it or learn something from it, he was satisfied. And if you wanted to challenge it, well, his idea was, fine, investigate it yourself and see if you come up with something better. One of the things that I'm trying to do in the classes, and one of the things I'll do on Saturday, is show how some of his ideas may be used in meditative practice and possibly to develop inner sense experiences along the lines that he taught, but not always interpreting everything that he said in the most easy or obvious way. So, continuing with his clairvoyant works, there are a couple items on this slide that I especially want to highlight. The Inner Life is a wonderful book that spans the gamut of things that are of interest to people who are living, learning, growing spiritually, with a lot of insight into the hidden side of things, the hidden laws of nature and powers in humanity. And so that's one I would recommend, although it's now available in a one-volume version. There's some interesting things if you can go back to the library here, for example, and get both volumes. The hidden side of things is especially interesting as a book for beginners, I think, because what he talks about is all the different ways in which in normal everyday life you can be going about shopping or attending a funeral or lying out in the sun. And there's a hidden side of what's going on there that you could be thinking about or aware of or possibly sensitive to. One of the things that most people don't realize is that we all, in a sense, have the clairvoyant ability of walking into a room and sensing whether we're welcome or safe there, whether it feels like a warm, inviting environment or whether it's hostile in some way. And as long as we're not a very anxious person so that we're projecting that onto the group, probably we've picked up something real in terms of an inner sense experience. And in a sense, the hidden side of things builds on that, so that once you notice that you can have a sensitivity to what he calls atmospheres, you may also be able to apply that in other areas you'd never thought of before. The Science of the Sacraments I already mentioned. I just wanted to include it under the clairvoyant slides. The Hidden Life in Freemasonry is all about co-masonry, which is a kind of masonry that involves both men and women, non-traditional in that sense. He was obviously very touched and moved and enthusiastic about Freemasonry. And I have to say that though I'm not necessarily myself attracted to Freemasonry, some of his most beautiful writing is in this book. It's also a little awkward in moments because whenever he's referring to some of the technical terms of Freemasonry, he'll put the first letters of the word and ... after it. So if you pay attention, you'll realize that he reveals those words, several pages later, or you can now look most of them up online. So reading it, you've got this incredibly beautiful writing, and then you've got a sort of crossword puzzle action that you have to do in order to really get the terms. Glimpses of Masonic History, published as Ancient Mystic Rites. I would not so much recommend that book. There's so much about the past of Freemasonry that we don't know that's speculative or even, in a sense, mythological. And Leadbeater explains it according to his clairvoyance and clears up absolutely every question and takes all that people knew at the time and tries to integrate it into a meaningful synthesis, starting with the idea that he had a past life in Egypt where all of this stuff was familiar to him. And I have to read that with a grain of salt. I think historic academic research that has been done since that time on the actual roots of Freemasonry would be a helpful corrective for some of those things. But on the other hand, if you think about the inner side of things, it's entirely possible that there's a kind of subtle or mystic history that goes behind things that doesn't necessarily manifest itself in any clear ways on the physical plane, and therefore I get also given the benefit of the doubt. But it's maybe a little dry reading for those who aren't motivated by the subject. And then there's the chakras. I did a talk on the Chakras, a Magical Mystery Tour the last time I was here, so rather than talk about that now, it's on YouTube if you're interested in looking at it. Here's an example of Leadbeater's teachings on the chakras as illustrated by Arthur Powell, whose books I'll talk about in a moment. There are some things that people would argue with Leadbeater about the chakras, but this idea that there is a seed of Kundalini, I think of that as a sort of empowering life force. And then each chakra adds another level of development, from feeling to being able to travel, to being able to understand empathetically, to being able to hear and communicate, to experiencing clairvoyance, which means seeing the environment that you're in. All of those things, I think, are very useful for any astral projector. And I think they come online as you're developing, and you can actually tell which chakra you're working on in any particular time, depending on what you're struggling with in your astral projection experiences. Here's an example of how Leadbeater clairvoyantly perceived one of the chakras. This is the heart chakra, which looks very different in most people's understanding. It's considered to be associated with the color green. He had a different mode of looking at things that was talking about several different kinds of life force moving through the body. And again, it might be valid, but I haven't perceived things in quite that way myself. There's the cover of the book, also available over here. So another thing to consider from Leadbeater's writings. Always in science, you have to make hypotheses for these things which you cannot reach. And the best hypothesis holds the field until something better is found, or until facts turn up which cannot be reconciled with that. And then the hypothesis must either be changed or extended. If you will ground your belief in spiritual revelations on the same sort of scientific basis, I don't think you will easily be shaken or troubled. I think this is an especially important teaching for us to consider, because whenever you have a spiritual teacher, there's always the question of authority. How much do you take in? How much do you believe on faith, for example? And what he's saying here is, think of it as provisional. Whatever is being presented to you is a provisional belief or belief system. If you adopt it, you'll notice certain things work for you, maybe not all of it, or it might be perfectly acceptable for you. But at some point, you'll either adopt it as the right thing and just move on from there, or you'll let it go, or you'll modify it. We're all doing this. And when I think of the subtitle of Blavatsky's great book, The Secret Doctrine, the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, I think that she's giving an important key there. Each of us is that synthesis. We make that synthesis by our inquiry into what's around us and what's inside of us. And so if we have this idea that everything we take in is a hypothesis and its usefulness to us, perhaps in solving our problems, is what we need to consider, then, as he says, we won't go wrong. So death and the afterlife was another area that Leadbeater was very much involved in. Starting very early, 1903, the other side of death scientifically examined and carefully described. Of course, he doesn't mean science in the way that we think about it. He means looking and investigating and questioning everything. One thing that Leadbeater was trying to do is, before he became a Theosophist, he was interested in spiritualism and made some experiments along those lines. And Madame Blavatsky came out very strongly against certain beliefs and practices of spiritualism. And this resulted in historic alienation between spiritualist organizations and the Theosophical Society. And one of the things that Leadbeater was trying to do in this book was reconcile the two. But he did it by trying to show that the spiritualist experiences had no theory behind them, and that the Theosophical theory, as he was elaborating it from his understanding of Blavatsky, was actually useful in helping people understand spiritualist experiences. What you'll get out of looking into this book, if you do look into it, is a great deal of information about 19th century psychic experiences, and that in and of itself is fascinating. And then where he fits them into the Theosophical worldview is also of interest. But this is not a book that's currently in print. However, there's one part of it especially that I want to underline called the desire elemental. Each of our subtle bodies has a body consciousness, and that body consciousness is not made up of a human consciousness, that's us. It's made up of something called an elemental. And the desire elemental is the elemental associated with the astral body and with our emotions. There's a long chapter about that, and it's one of the only places you can learn about this desire elemental. My belief is that these elementals are not aligned for most of us with the intentions of our souls or our higher selves, and that many of the problems that we experience in our relations to other people and in their relations to us is a result of these misaligned elementals. The life after death and how Theosophy unveils it is sort of a light version of the other side of death, and To Those Who Mourn is a lovely text that helps people who are grieving learn how to look at life from a different perspective, as Leadbeater saw it in his clairvoyant investigations, and as backed up by many of the teachings of Theosophy and Blavatsky. There's another book you might run across called Spiritualism and Theosophy. It's just it's the appendix, so to speak, to The Other Side of Death that was published separately, and therefore it's not something you would necessarily want to read unless you were especially interested only in spiritualism and theosophy. Another Leadbeater quote that I love: "That is only my personal testimony in the matter." Think about this in terms of the afterlife. "That is only my personal testimony in the matter, and I should not wish that any human being should base his convictions on that. He may take it, if he will, as evidence, but it is not proof. And he must remember that, and he must arrange his thoughts accordingly all the way through." I like this phrase very much. Take it as evidence, but it is not proof. And I think that it applies just as much to scientific exploration as to anything in the spiritual life. Occultism is another area of interest, and this sort of talks about the whole field of psychic influences, subtle bodies, astral projection, the forces of lightness and darkness, and so on. And these books are mostly out of print. I think actually on this slide they're all out of print, but I found them very interesting to look into. Some glimpses of occultism, ancient and modern, was made up of lectures that he did during a very long tour in the United States, some of them actually in the Chicago area. A very little known work, Some Occult Experiences. He had a secretary who was Dutch, a younger man named Johan van Manen, who had quite a number of psychic and spiritual experiences, and Leadbeater sorted them out, categorized them, offered some commentary on them, and I found that a very interesting thing to read, because you don't get a lot of that kind of writing in the theosophical literature that's dealing directly with people's experiences. Probably the book that I have least liked of all of what I've read by Leadbeater is Starlight, 7 addresses given for the love of the star. This was in the middle of the period when Krishnamurti was being promoted as the world teacher, and so he was called the star. But I took another look at it just before preparing this lecture, and I realized that if you go through it and you think higher self instead of star everywhere that you see the word star, it actually has some things that are worth thinking about. So this is a book that you may be able to find in the library here. And The Monad and Other Essays Upon the Higher Consciousness is also not very well known. A little more technical, but I learned a lot from it. So way back in 1899 in Clairvoyance, Leadbeater said something that I think is a very useful thing to keep in mind. It would be well for students to bear in mind that occultism is the apotheosis of common sense. I've used this phrase in several lectures, and what I like to highlight in it is the word apotheosis. That means a carrying up to God. So what he means is it has to be common sense all the way. So common sense on the physical plane. If there are other planes between where we are now and God, it has to be common sense on all of those planes. If we have some kind of direct or mystical experience of God consciousness, we have to be commonsensical about that too. Obviously, there are places you could get into a lot of trouble calling it that experience, and it's not a very humble thing to do either. I am always hearing about spiritual teachers who go on the road saying, I've had an enlightenment experience. And if you've read your Theosophy, the inevitable next question is, which one? Because they keep expanding as you go. So, common sense all along the line. So, continuing on the idea of occultism, there's an out-of-print book, talks on At the Feet of the Master, which can be interesting, and it's been incorporated into Talks on the Path of Occultism. The 3 volumes will be listed in a moment. The Masters and the Path, which I often hear is a book that has drawn people into the Theosophical Society because it presents a worldview where there are high spiritual teachers. They're there to support us in a lot of different ways, especially as we advance spiritually and ethically, as we develop a capacity for service. And possibly he lays it all out in a way that is a little more material. You get descriptions of the valleys and the houses and the furnishings of the master's retreats and so on. I think that's useful, and in that these places may have an actual existence on Earth. They could be astral locations. They could have been places that he imagined and didn't necessarily realize that he had imagined. We have to keep an open mind. But the idea of being led, I think, is something that a lot of us have experienced. We don't need to know what color the curtains were in the master's parlor in order to have that experience of being led. Talks on the Path of Occultism is now published in 3 volumes. It is in print. 3 of the Theosophical classics are involved. At the Feet of the Master, Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence, Mabel Collins' Light on the Path. At the Feet of the Master was supposedly by Krishnamurti. These are the text plus commentary. At the Feet of the Master, Besant has some commentary. Leadbeater has some commentary. The Voice of the Silence, it's all Leadbeater and some Ernest Wood. And Light on the Path, it's Leadbeater and a little bit of Besant. If you read only the Besant contributions to At the Feet of the Master, you'll get an abbreviated but very clearly delineated course in meditation. This set of books, I think, is an excellent introduction to the whole range of what Theosophy is. Most people would want to read these books unmediated, which is to say, read the text as it is, as it was originally presented, have your own responses and reactions to it, and then see what you think and feel about the commentary. But the commentary opens up many, many ideas for exploration. I had a graduate student from Harvard Divinity School who wanted to study Theosophy as a part of her master's degree, and we looked at those 3 books in the available time, a semester, And of course, I was also pointing her to other things, both in this tradition and outside of it, that counteract some of the more extreme statements. But personally, I feel that is something that many lodges could benefit, for example, from studying over a period of time. Again, Leadbeater. In the course of my own study, I have repeatedly come upon ideas which were quite new to me and have noted them down, thinking of them not exactly as discoveries, but as ideas that were fresh to me. Perhaps months afterwards or a year or two later, I have looked back at Esoteric Buddhism, one of the foundational texts of Theosophy, or The Secret Doctrine, and have found that the idea which I thought to be new was distinctly implied in that book, perhaps not stated in so many words, but certainly implied. I'm bringing this slide up because I've found not a few Theosophists who've studied Theosophy deeply operating under the impression that Leadbeater had cut himself completely short, cut himself completely off of the early Theosophical works. In my experience, I always find that there's a basis. Now, he may have taken it in a direction that is something we might have to think carefully through before we assign belief to it. But he asked us to do that anyway, so I think it's important that we inquire. But I think it's unfounded, actually, to point the finger and blame him for something that actually is just developed from earlier thought, such as in Esoteric Buddhism and The Secret Doctrine. Certainly many ideas which we have recently thought to be new ought to have been deduced by us. I can see how these truths follow from the other ideas, and I wonder now how I could have been so stupid as not to have made the deduction. This, I think, is an important phrase, too, because it emphasizes the idea that all of these clairvoyant theosophical teachings are progressive. They're evolutionary. As you develop, you learn more. As you understand more, new opportunities open up to you for further investigation. And if you go back then, from the new ideas to the old ideas, you'll often see how they illuminate each other in useful ways. But there has tended to be a split among Theosophists where some will always go back to Blavatsky and some will go back and forth, but tend more in the Leadbeater Clairvoyant and Leadbeater-Besant Clairvoyant direction. And there's no reason why they can't be a dialogue back and forth. So then we come to Reincarnation, and these books, I think, are very problematic. Most of them are out of print. They tend to be extremely material in the sense that you have people, you have bodies, you have warfare, you have intrigues in empires, you have hundreds, if not millions of years, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years as the background to this. Little difficult to reconcile with current geological and anthropological understandings in science. And yet, there may still be something valuable in them. Rents in the Veil of Time was a series of articles in the Theosophist. That's when they started. Man, Whence, How, and Whither was another book that came out during that period. And again, a lot of lifetimes, especially the lives of Alcyone. That was the star name that was given to Krishnamurti. What a lot of people don't know is why that star name was chosen. It's one of the stars in the Pleiades. And there was a period back in the 19th century where an astronomer had decided that the absolute center of the entire universe, not our galaxy, was the star Alcyone. So you can understand now that because Krishnamurti was supposed to be the world teacher, that Leadbeater was seeing him as the star around which the whole Theosophical universe rotated. And then there are 4 volumes of the soul's growth through reincarnation where the lives of particular people are traced that were not taken up in any of these other books. Man, Whence, How, and Whither is not a book I would necessarily recommend, but it was spun off into a shorter version, The Beginnings of the Sixth Root Race. This was a vision that was given to Leadbeater by a deva about what life might be like some thousands of years hence. And whether or not it has any relationship with what we'll experience at that time It's a really fascinating description of what life would be like if there was a constant interaction between people and devas or angels. And there are some esoteric groups that started from Theosophy in the 20th century that took this idea literally and wanted to build a community in California where the devas and the humans were interacting. I wrote about one of them in my book on the chakras, Iva Berg-Witten. She wanted to create a community based on colors. And there are interesting relationships of several temples of different colors in Leadbeater's book on the beginnings of the sixth root race. And then I want to talk about a section of the lives of Alcyone. The introduction is called The Band of Servers. For me, this is the most relevant piece that comes out of these books. The idea that there are people who incarnate over and over again who are dedicated to furthering the evolution of humanity, and that they find each other and that they create groups, that they work together in various ways. This is something that in the New Age is called light workers. So it's an idea that got carried forward from Leadbeater. The name got changed and the connection to Leadbeater was forgotten. But I think it's an especially useful thing to think about, and also to realize that what Leadbeater tried to do was trace the lives of more or less 250 living people back through hundreds of thousands of years and dozens of lifetimes. Whoever did that? You know, he was the first. And it's a very ambitious scheme. It might have been too ambitious in some respects. And yet we have to understand why not? You know, if he had what he believed to be the clairvoyant abilities to perceive these past lives, why shouldn't he constantly exercise those abilities on a larger and larger scale? And what I find about these books is something that he says in the next slide, which I think is the way that we need to read them. Oh, beautiful artwork that people don't see in the lives of Alcyone. Illustrations of past lives that clairvoyant painters did. This was by a woman named Maria Louisa Kirby. And there's another one. These books are so rare in their original that they go for hundreds of dollars. It might be a lovely presentation sometime for the library to have all of these illustrations out. They have multiple copies of the book so they could be turned to different pages. So here's Leadbeater. These accounts of the past are not printed merely as good stories. That's probably an exaggeration, though they often are that. They're very like boys' literature, lots of sword action and things like that. These accounts of the past are not printed merely as good stories, though they are often that, but as lessons in the working of karma life after life, full of instruction for the student and helpful for the realization of the continuity of human life. If it fails to be true in the sense that these people lived in the time periods when they lived, I don't think it fails to be true in the idea that there are certain kinds of things that you do that then will lead to another lifetime in which you have to undo it or do it better or do it right or improve on it. And from that standpoint, there's a lot to learn. And the lessons of karma that he's specifically talking about that are in the book are the interrelations of individuals, the results of benefits and injuries, links that draw egos together. The theosophical use of the word ego is for the whole self, the soul, not just the personality as we think of it now in psychology. Repulsions that drive people apart, and the formation of epochs through scatterings and reunions of related egos. So we have to think about the world that we're experiencing as being made up of people who are reincarnating. So we might want to think of any historic age as being the result of people from an earlier historic age that want to change things that we're experiencing now and redo or live through in a different direction, something that they experienced in the past. It's a wonderful, new and different way of looking at things that also has its ideas in the New Age. For example, there's a book by Jane Roberts, the medium, who channeled Seth, called The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events, that's related in some ways to these ideas. So the idea of the band of servers, he has a bunch of terms that he says goes along with this. Docility, which I think is a horrible choice of words, but what he meant was putting aside personal desires for the sake of the work. I don't think of that as docile. It's a lot of work to put aside personal desires. Comprehension, for the sake of intelligent cooperation in the work. That's a good one to think about. How many of us want to run out and save the world and go work in some country that seems to be underprivileged and get sent back because they say, we know better than you do what we need here, you know? Patience, so as not to be discouraged over the apparent lack of immediate results of our endeavors. That's self-explanatory. Industry, the flowing in of energy from behind that keeps us moving in spite of all hindrances and carries us over the dead point of exhaustion and despondency. So the idea is to recognize that if you're doing this kind of work, it may be enormously demanding and exhausting, but it's also possible that you can be open to a constant feeling of support coming from other levels of being. Support, insight, connections, things of this nature. Adaptability and comradeship. So we may learn to work together as a whole, to trust one another and make allowances for one another. That's something we need to learn in order to experience unity consciousness. Unless we're working in a group, we don't really know what unity consciousness is because we don't know what the challenges are to it. It's the group that's there to show us where our miscomprehension or lack of understanding of unity consciousness happens to lie. And this is one of my final slides, wrapping things up. Leadbeater also talked about theosophy and theosophical teachings. 3 of his books that are designed along these lines. The first 2 are technical, an outline of theosophy and a textbook of theosophy. I know some lodges will use those books sometimes as basic study course material. And then his autobiography of How Theosophy Came to Me, which is an embodiment of many of the teachings that he had as they played out in the course of his life. Some scholars have questioned the truthfulness of everything that he wrote. And again, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. It's sometimes possible that things that aren't true in this realm are true in another realm, and we may not know it, which is true and which isn't true. For all of us, what's true is our own personal experience, and if you experience it intensely enough, it has to be called a truth, even if it isn't quite aligned with the historical records. The thing is, it's not a good idea to try to persuade other people that it's the truth under those circumstances. Times change, and the method of presentation of our doctrine, theosophy, as I have said, may have to change with it, but the broad outline of theosophy simply is so. Don't imagine for a moment that because that is so, and that some of us can say that we know it to be so, don't imagine that we know the whole of it. There will always be wider and wider vistas opening before us. Whether we shall ever arrive at a full knowledge, how can one say? But at any rate, we try to mold our lives by the things we do know, and surely that is a reasonable basis to take. And of course, the idea is subsequent generations should improve on our knowledge. And I think he accepted the idea that some of his ideas would eventually be left behind, transcended, modified, or considered not really useful. Now I want to talk just briefly about, for me, what I consider to be the 4 most important books that I read in my early understanding of theosophy. This was before I read Isis Unveiled, The Secret Doctrine, and the collected writings of Blavatsky. And I think if you want an introduction to Leadbeater's and Besant's writings, these books organize things that you'll find scattered throughout all of his writings in a way that's eminently readable and opens up many, many possibilities, and then suggests to you where you can go for further information. And one of the things that I found was especially valuable was many of my own personal spiritual and astral projection experiences were confirmed by things that I had read here, even though they happened 20 or more years before I'd encountered theosophy. Another thing to keep in mind is that Leadbeater had that nasty authorly tendency to take the best part of something and put it in a different book and then refer to it. So you'll get wonderful information on the chakras that's not in the chakras book, in his book on Freemasonry. Now you have to buy both, right? Well, of course, he was maybe justified in doing that because this was one way to make money for the Theosophical Society. But it's awfully annoying if you're trying to really get the whole picture. And the valuable thing about these books, published in the 1920s, is that they pull all of those pieces together so you don't have to buy a book and read 10 pages in order to get the good part that you were looking for. And then the mental body and the causal body and the ego. And there's our favorite image of the path leading us onward. I think it would be right to say that Leadbeater has some contributions to our understanding of that path, and if we inquire into them in the way that he recommended, we will find value in them. And if we take them literally, probably we'll get lost. There has to be an equal amount of inquiry and study, I think, if you're going to look into his works. And there's a lot in my own personal experience that I've found of value. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions at this point.
I don't have a question, Kurt, but I wanted to follow up on that last image. I've seen that painting, and it's much larger than that. It's about 6 foot by 6 foot. One interesting thing about it, you see the hexagon in the center,
yes,
or that surrounds the center. Inside that is the painting. Outside is the frame. So he continued the painting off the canvas onto the frame. It's a remarkable, startling image to see it live.
And while I was looking for this image, I discovered that much later, 30-some years later, the Leeds Lodge created a stained glass version of it. And the imagery of that is gorgeous. I mean, it really comes alive with the light shining through it.
I think you said At the Feet of the Master is supposedly written by Krishnamurti. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that, because I thought that was attributed to him. I thought that was a given. So I'm wondering why supposedly.
It's a very controversial topic. And the reason that I do that is I straddle both the Theosophical Society and the academic community that writes about theosophy. And I feel that I need to be honest and truthful as I can on both sides. And that's not an easy thing to do. As a part of the book that I would like to write about Leadbeater, I want to write a series of introductory chapters that look at some of the controversies that exist in his life, including the controversy of the authorship of this book, and to look at it from a variety of perspectives. Ultimately, it doesn't matter where the book came from, because it's been of enormous value to hundreds of thousands of people in its existence. And there were very, the largest question is the extent to which Krishnamurti was capable of writing good English at that time when he was such a young person. Beyond that, I can't really go, because I would want to cite the books and the ideas and all of these little bits and pieces that I've been assembling slowly. That's the best I can do, I'm afraid. There are a few other questions about Leadbeater that I would have to deal with in the same way, because I'm still in the process of thinking my way through. And what I would like to do is present a picture of him that is neither the quasi-saint that you sometimes see in the Theosophical Society, nor the individual that is reviled in some other theosophical groups that are not related to Adyar. Neither black nor white, but a dimensional living human being that had good days and bad days, and areas of clarity and areas of issues that he was working on. I think it's important as a part of the process of healing some of the rifts that exist within different theosophical groups, at least to offer up this idea for consideration.
Kurt, could you say something about the relationship between Krishnamurti and Leadbeater? especially after the split, with the Krishnamurti splitting with the Theosophical Society.
Yes, certainly. So Krishnamurti was discovered, so to speak, by Leadbeater. This is fairly well known. He was a child living with his father on the Theosophical Society compound in Adyar. He was said to have had an extraordinary aura by Leadbeater, and then he was brought into the society and trained in a variety of ways, adopted by Annie Besant, given the best possible English education, under the idea that he would somehow embody a world teacher that would bring together the entire world in an experience of unity consciousness. And he would either be the herald, so to speak, of that teacher, or he would be the teacher himself. At a certain point in the late 1920s, Krishnamurti disavowed all of this and walked away and did his own thing and became a spiritual teacher in his own right. So in a sense, the idea that he had an extraordinary aura and extraordinary capacities as a spiritual teacher worked itself out, but not in the way that was expected within the Theosophical Society. And Leadbeater started to distance himself from Krishnamurti as Krishnamurti became more and more independent in the 1920s. So my understanding is that he never repudiated Krishnamurti, but he also didn't talk a whole lot about it, or talked about it from the standpoint. Well, there was one thing that I read in 1912. No, much later, early 1920s, where he said, "You have to understand." This was in a private letter. "You have to understand the whole world teacher project is in a sense an experiment. It's never been done. We don't know what the results are. We don't know where it's going to end up." And I think from that standpoint, it's important to understand that even though it didn't turn out the way it was expected to turn out, it could be called a successful experiment because Krishnamurti contributed so much to so many people's spiritual path. Personally, I feel that it was a pretty egregious act on the part of Besant and Leadbeater to decide that this young Indian man would be trained in the way that he was, because essentially he was supposed to leave his body and the world teacher would take over. It almost is a Frankenstein kind of experience. So from that perspective, I'm glad we didn't end up with a Frankenstein and that we got Krishnamurti as he was. Thank you.
If I can follow on, then, seeing that no one else is raising a hand, did Krishnamurti, from his perspective or from his writings or speaking, did he make reference? Was there communication between them?
More between him and Besant. He revered Annie Besant as a spiritual mother, even beyond the point where he broke off from the Theosophical Society. Leadbeater, not so much. Leadbeater was actually only actively involved in his training up through around 1912. They had a special retreat that they took in Sicily, Besant and Leadbeater and a few others. And supposedly during that period, there were many occult initiations that were gone through and so on. And from that point, other people took on his training, and Leadbeater was primarily in Australia. So already just separated by time and distance, they had less and less of a relationship. But as far as I know, Krishnamurti never said anything negative about Leadbeater, but he was not nearly so grateful to Leadbeater as he was to Annie Besant.
I was wondering what Leadbeater was doing in Australia for that length of time, touring, giving lectures. I live in Australia, and so I was just curious what he was doing there.
It's quite an interesting story. He was basically exiled there during the war because he happened to be in Australia when it broke out, and it wasn't possible for him to go back to India. He was actively engaged in creating the liturgy for the liberal Catholic Church. I should probably explain what that is. So the idea was mooted in the early part of the 1910s about whether it would be possible to restructure the Christian liturgy according to theosophical principles. And we've seen other versions of that. For example, I know of a Gnostic church that Stephen Heller is very involved with. He's a theosophist that has often come here and lectured. But this was a fairly early experiment along those lines. And what he did was not only the science of the sacraments, but he also wrote the words in collaboration with a few others, wrote the hymns, designed the buildings within which this would take place. And the one thing that they needed to carry forward was the so-called apostolic succession, which is the passing on of the power of being a priest that is supposedly in the Catholic Church, starting with St. Peter and then going, or St. Paul and then going, no, I guess it was Peter, going down through the generations, every priest, every bishop, every pope having been consecrated in this way. So in the middle 1800s, Pope Leo the something or other, I don't remember the exact number, declared papal infallibility. And this was not a popular idea in all of the Catholic churches. So there was a group in the Netherlands that broke away and decided that they were not going to be associated with the Church of Rome anymore. And they called themselves the Old Catholic Church. And there was a branch of it in London. Some theosophists discovered that and managed to get themselves consecrated as first priests and then bishops within the Old Catholic Church, and then used that as the basis for claiming apostolic succession in this new liberal Catholic Church. Of course, the question is, how liberal is it when only men can be priests, right? But this was an important idea for them at the time. So during this period from about 1915 to 1925 was when this church was formed, and Australia is one of the chief outposts for it. It had a strong following in England and in America. The American following is very much diminished, but I think it still has churches in Australia. And Leadbeater set up the church buildings in a grid based on 7 gemstones that were different colors, that were aligned with the chakras, and the altars and the bishops' croziers and all of these things were, connected with all of that. So it's a really fascinating idea. The one that I experienced in Ojai had a lot of interesting energy going on in it. So that was one thing. He was also resident in a place called the Manor, which was in Sydney. It was an oceanside mansion that had been turned into a theosophical colony. I haven't actually heard whether it's still a holding of the Theosophical Society. Does anybody know? Yes? Okay. So he was resident there. He trained many, many people. He led classes. He lectured. He didn't do a whole lot of travel beyond there except for a couple of trips to Java. So if you ever want to make a pilgrimage, so to speak, to Sydney, the Manor is there as a place to learn more.